Thanks, Bob. Thank you, everybody, for welcoming me in Chicago. My wife's giving a conference presentation here in downtown at the university, and so I said I'd come with her and we'd have a few days in Chicago. And then I thought, well, there's got to be an AES section in Chicago. In fact, I knew there was an AES section in Chicago. And so I thought, well, while I'm here, let's offer them something that I recently presented in Germany at the International Conference on Spatial Audio in Erlangen at Fraunhofer. And I called that presentation this Reconstructing Reality or Creating Illusion. Spatial audio is a topic that I've been interested in for some time, and this is a battle of ideas that has gone on since the very early days of stereophony. The idea of whether spatial audio recording and reproduction is intended to reconstruct something exactly that once actually happened, or whether it's simply a vehicle for creating some sort of artistic illusion. And as we shall see, it's one or the other or both, depending on the technology. But what I'm going to do is try to look at the places that we've come from. So if we go back to the early days when the battle lines in this particular war of ideas were set, and to look at what we can achieve with only two channels, and then to ask some questions about this business of stereo imaging versus what we'll broadly call spatial impression, to talk about timbral fidelity in recording and reproduction versus spatial fidelity in recording and reproduction, and also about the differences between natural and reproduced sound. Then, in more recent years, a load more loudspeakers have been shipped in to complicate the business, and this is where I'm going to try to have a look at what we might be able to achieve with the very large numbers of loudspeakers that are now possible in spatial audio systems, and whether that actually leaves us in a better position or a worse position than we were back in the days of only having two channels. So we'll return to the problem of the scientist's view of stereophony versus the engineer's or the recording engineer's view of it, and drop into a topic that is mainly an issue in computer graphics. That is the issue of the uncanny valley. I don't know whether any of you have ever heard about it, but it's something I shall introduce you to, the idea of the uncanny valley, and whether it has a parallel in audio reproduction. And to ask the question at the end about can we cross this threshold of complexity of moving from a small number of channels in spatial reproduction to many thousands or even hundreds of thousands, and to ask the question whether we need to. So if we look at the early days of spatial audio recording and reproduction, you'll find that really it's been all along a battle between this guy here who insists that the sound field has to be accurate and it has to be measurable and it has to be measurably similar to the one that was present in the natural environment, or the guy on this side who's pretty much saying, don't shoot me, I just want it to sound nice, and he doesn't really care whether it's accurate or not, he wants it to sound pleasant. And in the middle, we've probably got most people caught in the crossfire, which is those that realize that it's really neither just one thing nor just the other, but probably some combination of the two, the balance between which probably depends on the application. So this has been a battle that has raged pretty much, if you look at the 100 years worth of writing and discussion about spatial audio, you'll find that these views have been expressed one way or another. So it's really, we could call it a conflict between the scientist's view of stereophony and the recording engineer's view of stereophony, because in a sense this guy here, the scientist, has has always really written about and analyzed spatial audio with the idea that there ought to be some measurable identity between some notional source environment and some notional reproduction environment, so that you can actually reproduce the pressures and velocities at one or more points in space, and that you can analyze it mathematically. Whereas this guy here is really probably not very much bothered about that at all, and is primarily concerned with the business of creative control to achieve some sort of artistic result that may or may not have any parallel in measurable or identity to an original environment. So pragmatic solutions usually involve some combination of these two, and different people have attempted to discuss spatial audio from either one extreme or the other, and they sometimes meet in the middle. So if we go back to the 1930s and the original Harvey Fletcher ideas about stereophony, or at least spatial reproduction, we had at least the concept, although this was never really implemented in practice, of a recording stage here with a source radiating spherical wave fronts being picked up by a wall of microphones arrayed along the front of the stage. Each of these microphones being connected to a loudspeaker which radiates a source of spherical wave fronts in the reproducing arena or auditorium. And provided we have sufficient microphones connected to sufficient loudspeakers sufficiently close together, we get an approximation to the original wavefront being reproduced in the reproduction space here, so that these listeners here and here hear some semblance of a source in the correct location. So what they experience is something very similar to normal spatial listening within the constraints of the spacing of the microphones and the other aspects of the performance of the system. But of course and these days, as we shall see later, this has a lot of parallels with what has now become known as wavefield synthesis. But this is, or at least was then, back in the 30s, highly impractical, and the possibility to capture and reproduce many hundreds of microphone channels were simply not there, and it was, for practical purposes, reduced to a system involving perhaps 2 or 3 channels, which didn't reconstruct the wavefronts accurately, and so they experimented with combinations of level and time difference between 2 or 3 channels in an attempt to reproduce some semblance of phantom sources that listeners in a limited range of listening positions could experience reasonably accurately. And around the same sort of time, this chap Alan Blumlein in the UK was experimenting also with mainly 2-channel reproduction, created in the event in his patent by means of level differences between a pair of channels that could be created from a directional pair of coincident microphones, or indeed originally from a spaced pair of microphones with some sort of shuffling device to convert the phase differences into amplitude differences between the channels. And there's a big difference between Fletcher's wall of loudspeakers and this simplified solution. And the perceptual cues are not the same, but sufficient of them are probably preserved so that people in a central listening position get a reasonably accurate sense of a phantom source in a particular location. And it does rely on a rather limited range of listening positions, and the practical solution to this type of what we call Blumlein stereo now relies upon directional microphones, usually figure of 8s, and figure of 8s tend to have a poorer low frequency response than do omni microphones. But the problem, as most recording engineers will tell you is that figure of eights tend to have, because of their poor low frequency response, recording engineers, particularly classical recording engineers, often tend to prefer omnis because they sound nicer, and people like bass. And so the various solutions that have been tried for stereophony using spaced microphones tend not to stand up quite so well to theoretical analysis, but they sound lovely, and they give you a very pleasant decorrelated reverberation because of the spacing between the microphones, and you get a sensation of spaciousness that maybe gives somewhat poorer imaging, but nice low frequency response. And in the stereo version, two-channel stereo version, we get arrangements of mics like this deck of tree here, where the central mic is panned between the two left and right channels. Or indeed in the 5-channel surround version, something like this polyhymnia pentagon, but they're all based on a similar concept of trying to introduce time differences up to about a millisecond or two between the channels, and limited level differences between the channels. So something has to explain the reason why there is this perennial preference for spaced omnis, even though they don't stand up very well to theoretical analysis from a spatial reproduction point of view. And I think one of those reasons is probably that only 5% of the recordings that are sold on the commercial market, approximately 5%, let's say, depending on the year in question, are actually recordings where there is any sort of natural environment to reproduce. Very few recordings that we listen to on a day-to-day basis are actually recordings of natural spaces that are attempting to give you a concert hall-like experience in the home. Essentially, this is classical music, what we'll call classical music, isn't it? Where you try to recreate some semblance of a natural acoustical space in the reproduction environment. And even most classical recording engineers would admit that they don't actually attempt to reproduce natural acoustics in the listening room, because mostly that's not what people want. The commercial classical music recording sound often involves quite a lot of close microphones and artificial balancing, artificial reverb and so forth. So their recordings are essentially manufactured for a commercial audience to succeed on relatively small number of channels, and this is even true of 5-channel recordings. I mean, there are purists around, but it's a very small part of the commercial music market. 95% of what people tend to listen to is really manufactured in the studio by a means of artificial panning, effects, and so forth. So most of what we hear is some sort of amplitude panning between 2 or more channels, and the ubiquitous lexicon or whatever form of effects take your fancy. So, and under these circumstances, there's really no natural environment to reproduce whatsoever. The aim, if there is one, of such reproduction is probably to try to convert what this guy hears in the recording studio as accurately as possible to the listener in the home. So, and I asked the question, well, what's her reference? So a lot of people listen on headphones these days, and if you're listening on a mobile phone or an iPod on a pair of headphones, you're probably not listening to binaurally recorded stereo. You're probably listening to amplitude panned stereo, and what you're hearing, I mean, is probably inside your head. Quite often it sounds at the back of your head, somewhere down your neck quite often. So the spatial reference is very unnatural indeed. And anyway, she's probably not even thinking about whether it sounds like a concert hall. She's probably remembering a nightclub situation, or where she last heard that record played, or whatever. So the idea that most people listening are actually referring to some sort of reference acoustical environment and expecting what they hear in reproduced sound to be something like a natural space is probably very small indeed. I mean, we're an unusual audience. I mean, if you sit at home, you might be thinking of things more in terms of, does it sound like the concert hall where I last heard that Shostakovich symphony or whatever? But I would argue that most listeners don't have any idea of what the original should have sounded like. They simply want it to sound nice. Let's look at some of the lessons from two-channel stereo that might come in useful later when we start to think about more channels. Well, I'm going to have a look at Gunther Tyler to begin with, and Gunther Tyler wrote a thesis in around 1980. And essentially, the conclusion of his thesis was something on the lines of two-channel stereo ought to sound terrible, but it doesn't. And he was trying to find some reasons why two-channel stereo sounded much better than it should. Because what he was pointing to was that if you have two loudspeaker channels, and you sum the signals together at the ears of the listener, because there's a time delay involved, so for example, the signal from the left loudspeaker gets to the left ear slightly earlier than the signal from the right loudspeaker gets to the left ear, and the other way round for the other ear. You ought to get, and you do get, a form of comb filtering response at the two ears as a result of the summation of the two signals with a small time delay. And his point was, if you measure the coloration or the comb filtering that arises at the two ears, you would think that the result would sound terribly colored and terribly timbrally distorted, but in fact it doesn't. And so he wanted to know why this was, and what he discovered was that when some sort of phantom source, some spatially accurate phantom source was perceived, then the sound coloration rapidly disappeared. But when the listener couldn't create a phantom source, then it sounded colored. So there was some sort of relationship between being able to identify a phantom source and the suppression of the sound coloration that ought to arise. And he did this by testing it with a head and a pair of loudspeakers, and reproducing this binaurally to listeners with headphones. And by moving the head across the stereo image, what you ought to get with a stationary source panned to both loudspeakers is a source that moves as you move your head. And he found that in binaural listening, when you were listening with two ears, you could identify a phantom source accurately, and the sound color was fine. The sound color hardly changed at all. But with monaural listening, with one of the ears disabled or blocked up, the comb filtering effect could be very easily detected. And so these are some of the results of his experiments. And what he showed was that this KL curve here is the sound color changes, the perceived sound color changes. And this RI curve here is the detectability of directional changes. So essentially RI is the spatial, the ability of the listener to identify a spatial object, if you like. And KL is the detectability of timbral changes. So RI is the spatial curve, and KL is the timbral curve. And you can see that as one goes down, the other one comes up. And when the spatial object is very clearly detectable, then the timbral changes are minimal. And when the spatial object is not detectable very well, then the timbral changes are very audible. So this was a rather clear conclusion for him that there is some sort of magic decoloration that takes place when spatial identity is created. And what he determined was, and it's still a very controversial theory, but it does seem to stand up, as we'll see later, that if you can localize the loudspeakers And his claim was that this is what you're doing, really. You're not localizing the phantom source according to the traditionally understood summing localization, but you're actually localizing the loudspeakers separately. You're localizing the left loudspeaker and saying, oh, there's a source coming from there. And then you're localizing the right loudspeaker and saying, oh, there's a source coming from there. And, oh, they are very similar, these two sources. They must be reproducing the same thing. And then coming to a judgment about where the phantom source is between the loudspeakers based upon the differences between the two signals. And so his idea was that if you can identify the loudspeakers separately and decode those as independent sources, then you can decolor the phantom source. But if you can't do that, then the phantom source then the source is essentially as colored as you would expect from the spectrum that you measure at the ears. He determined that this was a form of psychological processing to do with what he called Gestalt association. And I think it's actually quite important. I thought it was rubbish for years, and I thought he was mad. And I've come to think that maybe he had something, because one of my PhD students did something a few years back with wave field synthesis, as we shall see later, which sort of proved Tyler to have been along the right lines. So there is some sort of relationship between being able to localize the loudspeakers, being able to create a phantom source, and to being able to ignore the coloration that might otherwise be expected in two-channel stereo. Now, another thing. Thank you, excellent. This gentleman, some of you may remember him, Stanley Lipschitz, he wrote a very influential article in the AES Journal back in 1986 called "Stereo Microphone Techniques, Are the Purists Wrong?" And he had a jolly good swipe at any form of stereo recording technique that wasn't really Blumlein stereophony, crossed pair, or amplitude pan stereo. He acknowledged that a lot of recording engineers liked spaced microphones, but he had a jolly good sort of physicist's critique of them, saying, I know of no published research showing that the 2 or 3 channel spaced microphone arrangements can in any consistent way recreate a semblance of the original wavefront in the listening room, let alone in the vicinity of the listener's head. And this is a sort of good example of the scientist's approach to stereophony, he's talking about the reconstruction of an original wavefront, and the idea that stereophony is about trying to recreate an original wavefront. And indeed, if you analyze spaced mic stereo from that point of view, it's really rubbish, it doesn't work. So, and he would come up with statements like, many engineers aim only to produce a spread of sound images which seems pleasant. And he used that in a very derogatory sense, as if that, why would anybody want to do anything like that? And actually, that is what most sound engineers try and do. It's to create a spread of sound images which sounds pleasant. And really, in my view, there's nothing wrong with that. He says imaging in my sense, in the sense of my definition, would appear impossible in spaced microphone stereo. Well, not actually true, really, if you listen to it. But this one is interesting, because I think it does come back later to haunt us. One sign of a good stereo recording reproduction system, in addition to producing stable images, is that the loudspeakers are not audible as sources of sound. And we will come back to this, because he recognizes the importance of a 2-channel stereo system in which the loudspeakers essentially appear to disappear, and where one can sort of hear through the loudspeakers to the signals behind them, and in which the reflections of the listening room and so forth seem to be ignored. So Stanley Lipschitz and the issue of purist microphone techniques. And it led me to ask the question, why are all these arguments about stereo reproduction anyway about phantom image localization? And you find that anybody writing about and doing research into stereophony is always, the only thing they ever measure is localization, and the localization of phantom images. And I have often wondered what the reason for this is, and I partly think it's because it's measurable, and so people measure it. And one of the obvious things to do when you're doing research on spatial audio is to say, can you locate the sound source? And you say, yes, it's over there. And it seems like the right thing to do because that's what you think spatial audio systems are for. But actually, as we proved a few years ago, most people don't care about it. Although it seems like an important aspect of the scientific approach to spatial audio reproduction, the exact location of phantom images and the ability to pinpoint them is not the main thing people notice or care about in sound reproduction. And we did some experiments with 5-channel surround a while back, in which we attempted to find out which subjective parameters both experienced listeners and naive listeners found important when listening to 5-channel surround reproduction. And we found that timbral fidelity was much more important than spatial fidelity. So we would produce a number of different versions of a spatial audio reproduction, and we would degrade them by degrading both the spatial imaging performance and the surround envelopment and the timbral quality. And we did some fairly sophisticated statistics to discover which of these factors most influenced both experienced listeners' ratings of overall sound quality and naive listeners' preference for the reproduction. And what we find here is that these are the coefficients of importance, if you like. So the taller the bar is up the vertical, the more important it is for their preference or their judgment of the overall sound quality. And what you can see here is that the biggest bars by far, this is the experienced listeners, exp, and N is the naive listeners here. What you can see is the biggest bars by far go for timbral fidelity, so people care about that much more. Frontal spatial fidelity is the imaging in the front 60 degrees or so. And what we found is that the experienced listeners found it moderately important, and the naive listeners didn't even notice it. These were just ordinary punters off the street. You know, they weren't sort of, they weren't recording engineers or sound engineering students or what have you. They were just average listeners. And you can see that actually frontal spatial fidelity didn't feature at all in their preference for different versions of the sound reproduction. For the experienced listeners, surround spatial fidelity, that was the sort of envelopment and spatial impression gained from the rear channels, if you like. The experienced listeners hardly cared about that at all, and the naive listeners thought it was quite, you know, a bit more important. So the naive listeners liked the spatial effect from the rear channels, which was a form of immersion, spatial immersion, if you like, didn't care about imaging, and then both of them cared quite a lot about timbral fidelity. So we found that timbral fidelity was crucial to good sound quality, which is pretty obvious really, but it does, and we found that it explained about 70% of overall judgments of sound quality, and the spatial aspects of sound reproduction accounted for the other 30% or so. And it may help to explain why spaced omnis sound so good, because they are timbrally nicer than figure of eights, for example. Two-channel stereo is surprisingly good timbrally, in fact, as we shall see later, compared with things like wavefield synthesis. What about reverberation and reflections? Well, we also found that it's possible to get very good envelopment. This vertical scale here is an envelopment scale where 100 is the best envelopment, or the most envelopment that you can get, I should say. And this is the coverage angle of a number of loudspeakers around the listener radiating decorrelated sound energy. So we panned decorrelated reverberant sound to a number of loudspeakers around the listener and looked at the sort of coverage angle that reverberant sound needed to occupy before the listeners experienced a certain degree of envelopment. And what you can see is that actually it rockets up quite quickly for the first 50 degrees or so, up to about 90 degrees of coverage angle. And really, we've reached pretty much saturation in the envelopment curve by the time that the diffuse sound energy occupies about 90 degrees in front of the listener. And you don't get much improvement once you go beyond that. A little bit. I mean, you can see that it continues to increase a bit, but by no means very much. So we found that you could get 80% envelopment by only 3 loudspeakers or so arrayed across the front 90 degrees. And there were some experiments also done in Japan, which suggested that you could reproduce a satisfactory impression of a diffuse sound field with only 4 loudspeakers located in these grey locations here, which turn out rather conveniently to be pretty much the locations of the 5.1 surround standard. I don't think, well, I don't know, you could argue that they knew that beforehand, but that was the result, and they found that decorrelated noise reproduced from those 4 locations was adequate to give the same impression as a totally decorrelated sound field. Once you got beyond about 5 loudspeakers, there seemed to be no advantage whatsoever in having any more when it came to reproducing the impression of a diffuse sound field. So in fact, you know, we can get reasonably good imaging at the front and quite good diffuse reverberation from relatively few loudspeakers. And when we think about the reflection characteristics of natural sounds and compare them with reproduced sounds, what you'll notice is that, of course, with real musical instruments, the reflections arise from the source itself, creating a wavefront which bounces off the surface to create a natural reflection of that sound object. And each of these sources in this space will create a unique reflection pattern depending on its location and its relationship to the surfaces around it. So that signature of reflections from each instrument, depending on its directivity characteristics and so forth, is probably one of those things that uniquely allows us to identify real sounds from artificial ones. And I'm completely amazed by how easy it is to tell when something is reproduced and when it's real. I mean, I don't know whether you can do this, but even from a corridor, 100 yards down a corridor, I could tell you whether the instruments playing in the next room are real or whether they're coming out of loudspeakers. And you would think that was impossible, considering the quality of loudspeaker reproduction. Well, something's going on here, and to me it may have partly to do with this natural reflection characteristic that's generated from real sources. Because in fact with loudspeakers, you get a different situation. What happens is you've got a phantom source, phantom violin here, reproduced between a pair of loudspeakers based on the amplitude differences between the loudspeakers, but the reflections are reflections of the loudspeaker signals, not reflections of this source here. It's not radiating anything, and it doesn't have a directivity characteristic. What you're getting is a reflection of the loudspeaker and its directivity characteristics. So it's a different situation, isn't it? And there's some evidence from the literature and from experiments that have been reported that if the reflections from the loudspeakers are sufficiently similar to those to the direct sound coming from the loudspeakers, then the brain can say, aha, that's a reflection coming from that loudspeaker because it's very similar to it in terms of its spectrum and so forth, and then ignore it. Because in fact, if we look at the way in which we learn to survive in reflective environments. And this is something that Siegfried Linkvitz has pointed out. He says that, I'm not going to read all of this, but essentially the thrust of his argument in this paper called Room Reflections Misunderstood, which was presented at the 123rd convention, he's basically saying that in natural environments like forests or valleys or whatever, you learned the reflected sound environment, and it became a form of acoustic background that allowed you to identify threats like a tiger creeping up behind you and about to eat you or whatever, and separate them from the reflections in the environment, because you essentially learn to ignore the static acoustical background and concentrate on the foreground. And his view is that the listening room is the modern savanna or forest, where we can learn to ignore the static acoustic background, which is in this case, and concentrate on the signals coming from the loudspeakers. So the acoustic background being the room and the loudspeakers in them and the reflection characteristics thereby created. And listen through the loudspeakers essentially to the sound that is being generated by them. But again, it would appear only to be the case if we can localize the loudspeakers separately and thereby decide, this is a sound coming from over there and those are its reflections, and therefore we can ignore it. And so we then bring about the ability to create an illusion of something delivered through the loudspeakers that is better than it ought to be. So these are all sort of hypotheses, but we move on to the modern day where we've discovered the ability to ship in large numbers of loudspeakers, extra ones, and by and large, because we are an audio industry and we make our money out of selling stuff, selling more loudspeakers is a jolly good thing. But I'm about to show you that maybe it's not such a good thing as we have thought, it can actually make a lot of our problems worse, and we may find that we'd be happier back where we started. So this guy in the middle is a bit confused because surely he thinks more loudspeakers ought to make all this situation better. But of course, what signals should he send to these loudspeakers? Maybe some form of sound field synthesis or sound field reconstruction has to be the answer. So we can now truly get to this scientist's dream of being able to reconstruct spatial wavefronts, sound fields accurately. Or should we just do advanced stereo? Should we just do what we did with 2 channels and try and extend it to 500? Lots of channels can create an approximation to a natural sound field. We believe that this to be true because we're getting closer to being back where Harvey Fletcher started with that wall of loudspeakers. But we have the problem that it is actually only an approximation, because you can only get loudspeakers so far apart, and you're not actually creating a natural sound field, you're creating a mathematical approximation to it. And then we have to ask the question, is a close approximation to a natural sound field or an original wavefront better than a distant one? And that's where the problems begin to arise. And I'd like to just spend a few moments discussing the differences between how we might address these very large numbers of loudspeakers, because there are 2 different schools of thought. And if you look at the competing, what we're now calling sort of 3D or immersive stereo systems, they fall into 2 broad camps. The advanced stereo camp are things like Dolby Atmos, Auro 9.1, NHK's 22.2 systems, and they've all got considerably larger numbers of loudspeakers than, say, 2-channel stereo or 5.1, and they usually got more layers, so there's some height involved as well. They're often irregular layouts, so they don't lend themselves particularly well to scientific sound field reconstruction. And usually, and I say this with the greatest of respect to these systems, there is no guiding principle about how you should address those loudspeakers. They say absolutely nothing about how you should generate or pan signals between them. They sort of leave it up to the user. And it's actually very hard. I mean, trying to come up with a 22.2 channel pan pot is sort of pretty challenging. And what often happens is people just end up doing amplitude panning between sort of 2 or 3 of them and then hoping for the best. And there is no unifying principle or underlying theory for any of these about how those loudspeakers are driven. There is no driving function as there is in wave field synthesis, for example. And it's really just up to the recording engineer here to figure out, with the help of various wizards and effects and panning modules and what have you, how to split the signal up and say, I want the helicopter coming out over there. All right, let's pan it over there. The job becomes very hard, but essentially these are extensions of conventional stereophony. They're extensions of the idea that it's a creative process and that you've got to figure out what to send to each of the loudspeakers in order to make it work. Whereas the sound field synthesis approaches, like wave field synthesis and higher order ambisonics, are really scientists' approach to spatial audio, and they do attempt in one way or another to reconstruct some original wave field. And they use a large number of loudspeakers with explicit loudspeaker driving functions. So there is a mathematical relationship defined that essentially determines how the signals are to be split up in terms of time, amplitude, and spectrum to be fed to the loudspeakers. They've often been horizontal only. Nothing precludes them from being fully three-dimensional, but because of the complexity, they've often been horizontal only so far. And they aim to be accurate over a reasonably wide listening area. And they're limited in most cases by what's called spatial aliasing at high frequencies. And that is, what you're doing is really sampling the wavefront at discrete intervals in space. And the result of that, rather like the effect of aliasing in digital audio, where you're sampling the signal in time at discrete intervals, there are artifacts associated with that, and they limit the frequency range over which it can be successfully done. And the same is true in wavefield synthesis, is that there's an upper frequency limit above which true wavefront reconstruction does not take place, and all sorts of weird stuff happens above the spatial aliasing frequency. And so I'm grateful to Dima de Vries for giving me this nice little animation of how wavefield synthesis works. It's essentially an extension of the Dutch Huygens principle. Can't say Huygens in true Dutch. Any Dutch persons here who can say it with the proper degree of gutturalness? I can't do it. Anyway, so the idea is that that a loudspeaker radiates spherical wavefronts. So if this is the original source to be recreated, what we could do is put a line of loudspeakers on at a distance along one of these notional curved wavefronts, and each of them could radiate wavelets, the sum of which would become equivalent to the original spherical wavefront. And in the generalized solution, we then can straighten out this line or this array of loudspeakers into a straight line, not along the spherical wavefront, but we can delay and amplitude shape the signals coming out of the loudspeakers in order that the impression of a spherical wavefront does indeed get created. So we use signal processing to drive the loudspeakers in such a way that we synthesize using superposition a new spherical wavefront, and therefore we can create a virtual source which sounds, if you're sitting out here in front of the loudspeaker array, you can create something that sounds like a real source behind the array at this notional loudspeaker position. And the aware amongst you will realize that this is really very, very similar to what we started out with at the beginning, which is the Harvey Fletcher wall of loudspeakers and microphones. Now, is this actually a good idea? Well, we go to Sascha Spores and Jens Ahrens in 2008, who found that for wavefield synthesis, that even when ignoring spatial sampling, the desired wavefield is not reproduced accurately within the listening area for curved secondary source contours. The area with almost sampling artifact reproduction is not at a constant position. The sampling artifacts exhibit irregular structures and are essentially perceived as coloration of the virtual source. And rather similar things with higher order ambisonics. Here, exact reproduction within the listening area is in principle possible. Almost sampling artifact-free reproduction is possible in a circular region around the listening area. The sampling artifacts exhibit quite regular structures. The sampling artifacts may give rise to strong coloration of the virtual source, and higher audio ambisonics potentially suffers from non-uniqueness and ill conditioning. So some suggestions that although a certain degree of scientifically accurate spatial reconstruction is possible, all is not totally rosy in the garden, and there is indication of the issue of strong coloration under both circumstances. Helmut Wittek in 2007 suggested that spatial aliasing in wavefield synthesis introduces coloration to the virtual sources. Aliasing is particularly disturbing because it changes rapidly with source or listener movements, and considerably large amplitude peaks and notches are noticeable up to the highest frequencies. He found that the coloration that we hear with such systems can be predicted rather well by an analysis of the spectral alterations of the ear signals. So if we look at what's being created at the ears and we measure the spectral coloration of the ear signals in purely technical terms, that it does actually rather well predict, using a timbral coloration psychoacoustic model, the perceived coloration of the signals. Interestingly enough, what he found is that two-channel stereo gave rise to the least coloration of all, which is back to the Tyler thing really about the fact that when we can localize the loudspeakers, we can do a certain amount of decoloration. And if you look at his results, what we can see is the perceived coloration up the vertical axis here is shown here for a real sound source, so it's fairly low for a real sound source. What you can see is that the two-channel stereo version, which is here, really has almost the same low coloration as the real sound source. And these are all the wavefield synthesis versions with some measure of ordinary two-channel stereo at high frequencies. And what you can see is, okay, very narrowly spaced wavefield synthesis, where the loudspeakers are only 3 centimeters apart, can achieve reasonably low coloration, but you get up to something like 12 centimeter loudspeaker spacing, and the coloration is much higher than it is in two-channel stereo. So there is some suggestion here that wavefield synthesis is much more colored than two-channel stereo. So he concluded that stereophonic reproduction has advantages compared with WFS, because in WFS the discrete loudspeaker signals can't be segregated due to their density and arrival time and incidence angles. And really this is a very important point, it seems to me, that because the loudspeakers are so close together in wavefield synthesis, and we've got to a situation where you really are now almost accurately reproducing a wavefront, but not quite, and you can no longer localize the loudspeakers as individual separate sound sources, you can't decolor it any longer. And he reckons that really he says here, the experiments described and others have shown that a certain dependency of the perceived sound color on the superimposed sound field exists. He says it leads to the hypothesis of partial decoloration in stereophonic perception and an interpretation of Tyler's association model. So there is this idea that when you've got very close loudspeakers and you can't separately localize them, you might get some trouble. Moving on, let's think about, well, one of the good things about wavefield synthesis, it might seem, is that you can create so-called focused sources. And when I first heard wavefield synthesis, this was one of the things I was most impressed about. Down in that little room in Delft, where they used to do the experiments, is one of the best demonstrations of wavefield synthesis I've ever heard. And you can create sound sources right out in front of the loudspeakers in the room, so-called focus sources, which you can't do with ordinary two-channel stereo reproduction. So this did seem to be a great advantage. But even though you might be creating a virtual source that is almost holographic out in the room here, it's still not behaving really quite like a real sound source. It's actually radiating backwards rather than forwards, if you like. The sound waves are radiating towards it rather than away from it. And it doesn't create natural reflections. This is not a real sound source, the focus source in the room. It's a virtual source, and no reflections arise from it. So it's not creating a natural reflection pattern in the room as if a real instrument were playing there. You have to synthesize those reflections artificially and create them as if they were coming from behind the loudspeakers. And fairly recently, Wiersdorf and his colleagues showed that here in practice the creation of focus sources with WFS is not free from perceptual artifacts. And what he found that he was looking for descriptive artifacts, that descriptive attributes that characterized the perception of focused sources. And he found that amongst the most important artifacts that were identified by listeners was coloration again. So the most dominant attribute pairs were those regarding audible artifacts, coloration, and the position of the focused source. A second experiment with different linear array lengths and different listener positions was done. It could be shown that artifacts could be reduced by using fewer loudspeakers. In addition to these artifacts, the strong dependency of the spatial aliasing frequency on the position of the listener for focused sources will introduce even more coloration in a real setup using a fixed pre-equalization filter for the whole listening area. So you can see here his results where with a very long array of loudspeakers, this one here, this is the number of artifacts shown up the vertical axis. Here is few artifacts at the bottom and many artifacts up the top. Now, the reference, which was a real source, has very few artifacts, and the longer the array of loudspeakers and the more loudspeakers there were in it, the more artifacts there were. So, well, I wonder if we need to talk about this one. Well, this is basically another paper that Anthony Tucker presented at the 52nd AES conference last year. He described what he called a dirty little secret of reconstructed sound fields, and that was something rather similar, really, was that we get the idea that scientifically accurate sound fields must be desirable, ones that are nicely aligned, ones that are accurately reproduced. And he found that actually people preferred systems that had been deliberately misaligned to introduce a degree of time delay and variation between the channels so that they weren't as accurately aligned in time and in amplitude. He found, here we are, yeah, he was looking at this previous research from a German pair, Zotter and Neustenig, in 2010. When loudspeakers have been time-aligned with reference to the center of a reproduction sphere, listeners involved in experiments have noticed disturbing phase artifacts and close-to-head localization of virtual sound sources. So he introduced what he called a form of spatial dither. I must say I wouldn't call it spatial dither, but what he means here is a deliberate fixed time misalignment of the channels in this hemispherical array of loudspeakers. And he found in this study at a ratio of just over 5 to 1, subjects expressed a statistically significant preference for the spatial imagery associated with the application of spatial dither. In other words, when he deliberately misaligned the loudspeakers in time, people preferred it quite a lot more. In fact, 5 times as many people preferred it as when it was perfectly aligned. So these are all bits of evidence that seem to be suggesting that lots of loudspeakers and perfect alignment don't lead us down a very satisfactory path, and something weird must be going on. And it led me to wondering what it is that is weird that's going on when we start doing it more accurately. Because you'd think more accurate, yes, got to be better. Actually, more accurate turns out to be worse. And so we start thinking about fidelity and naturalness. And naturalness is something that seems to pop up again and again in discussions when you ask listeners to describe sound quality. Naturalness is an attribute that pops up a lot. And it's what we might call a higher level cognitive response in psychoacoustics. When we listen to sounds, or indeed view images, we are, I think, comparing them with some sort of learned idea of what is real. And we weigh up a lot of low-level factors or attributes in what we hear or see, and we weigh them in relation to a remembered experience of natural listening or viewing conditions. And if they don't ring true, so to speak, we say, that must be artificial. And we need to ask how this relates to sound field synthesis. And it led me to looking into this business of the uncanny valley in vision, or at least computer graphics. And this is not a new idea. This chap called Mori, a Japanese in 1970, came up with what was only a hypothesis, but seems to be a good one, that if we have a scale which he called familiarity up here, I would sort of call it naturalness, really, but and we have human likeness plotted along the horizontal. We start off down the bottom end of the scale with something very much unlike a natural human, and he was using the idea of synthetic people, really, sort of robots and puppets and anything that looks like a natural human. So industrial robot down the bottom end here, well, it clearly doesn't look like a human. It's got to be artificial. We're not going to argue about it. It doesn't creep us out. As we become more human-like, the naturalness rises and rises and rises. Humanoid robot, stuffed animal. Yes, we're saying, yes, beginning to look more natural. Begins to look a bit too natural and starts looking weird. And so we take a dip in the cognitive plausibility response, if you like. And at the bottom here, we've got the corpse, the zombie, the prosthetic hand, stuff that looks freaky, bit odd, bit too natural, but not quite natural. It's like this one here, this girl on the left. She's a bit odd, isn't she, don't you think? I mean, if you met her on a dark night, you'd think, I'm not sure, really. There's something a bit starey about her and a bit creepy. And as we get back up the other side of the curve here, we begin to approach reality or natural, true human likeness when we start to accept it again. And this uncanny valley has been a difficult one for computer graphics people to cross, for example. I don't know whether it's true or not, but you know they talk about Shrek, the movie, and various other high-quality animations where they had to sort of pull it back from the degree of quality and naturalness that they had managed to achieve because it got too close to being like real people or like real objects, and people found it freaky. So they actually pulled it back and made it more cartoonified, if you like, in order to make it acceptable. And I think they had stumbled into the uncanny valley. I nicked a little video off the internet, and it's quite good in that it gives us a sort of is it going to work? I wonder. Oh, I think it may. Oh, yeah. Oh, I haven't got any sound, but never mind, you get the...
いいえと返事をします。いいえ。顔をしかめます。
Trying to find a cigarette.
Oh, Hal, do you read me? Who you read me, Hal? Hello, Dave.
Jim, can you record the talk back? Record.
Because I can communicate in many of the ways that people do. I can tell you that I'm sad, mad.
機械の子供の能力を想定して作られ、人が近づくと大きな目をキョロキョロする。
Yeah, you bet. I'll call you back in within an hour. Okay.
Right to the North Pole, of course. This is the Polar Express.
Mighty and all-powerful. This, I promise. Imagemetrics is a markerless, performance-driven animation company. We specialize in high-quality facial animation for video games and films. Whew. I mean, really? Can we just skip that question? They really, really are bad. Not good.
女性にとってお肌は大事ですよね。だから虫除けはブレイシャワーを使ってます。意外と錆びないんですよね。
アンドロイドもおすすめ。お肌に優しいプレシャワー。
Anyway, you get the idea. That essentially gets close to being real, and it starts to be freaky. And various people, including me, over the last few years, have been wondering whether there is something similar. I mean, this is all clearly very visual and very much related to human likeness, and we're talking about sound reproduction and naturalness, but the question is there an uncanny valley for sound? And Glenn Dickens hypothesized that there could be such a phenomenon in his paper from the 52nd conference called The Uncanny Valley of Spatial Voice. And he suggests here that as the potential for spatial and audio detail increases, there's the potential for careless or unexpected audio nuances to impart an unease or a negative preference for a particular system design. He also says here, a similar effect may be true of speaker virtualizers. This is crosstalk cancelled binaural, if you like, with the effect noted subjectively as a disturbing head suck. I mean, I was talking to Bob about this in the car yesterday, and most crosstalk cancelled binaural that I've heard has this sort of head suck effect, but not all. Such effects are definitely uncanny and related to the sense of space and presence, and perhaps confusion, though typically not around the subject itself. So there is the possibility, I think, that some of this close but not quite sound field reconstruction is similar in idea to the problem of the uncanny valley in computer vision, whereby as we become more sophisticated and get closer to producing something that sounds almost right, a different sort of critical faculty begins to kick in the brain. You know, when you're judging the artificial thing, like a synthesized sound, if it's a synthetic sound that's nothing like a real sound, or it's just like a funky synthesizer sound, you say, oh, it's just synthesizer, it just sounds like a synthesizer. But if it's trying to emulate a piano or something like that, you suddenly become more critical of it, because then you're comparing it with your natural memory of a piano, and you're saying, it sounds like it ought to be a piano, but there's something wrong with it. Rather than, it sounds synthetic, therefore I don't have to bring those critical faculties into play. It's almost as if we switch from one mode of criticizing a stimulus into another at this point, and perhaps by getting too real with spatial sound reproduction, we bring about a separate set of critical faculties that starts to compare what we're listening to against natural rather than artificial. And maybe two-channel stereo is sufficiently artificial to be ignored. I don't know. This is just somewhere where I'm going with this. So the extremes of the range, according to this confused man here, might be, on the one hand, oh, it sounds like an audio system. So I'll say, it's reproduced audio. I don't care, it's reproduced audio. It sounds like reproduced audio. I'm just going to enjoy it for what it is. Whereas when it gets too complicated and too mathematically correct, if you like, then the response might be, it sounds like it ought to be real, or it sounds almost real, or it sounds almost natural, but something's strange, something is wrong, it doesn't quite add up. So, just going to try and conclude all this rambling by asking whether we can cross this complexity threshold in sound reproduction, and whether we need to. Listening to two-channel stereo here, well, it still sounds amazingly good. I think most of us would agree that actually the best two-channel stereo probably is amongst the best things one can listen to and sounds pretty amazing. However, there are some limitations to two-channel stereo, and there are some applications in which it may be desirable to introduce large numbers of loudspeakers to create very scientifically accurate sound fields. For example, a project I was involved in recently was to do with creating distinct sound zones in a room. You've probably come across this, the idea of bright and dark sound zones, sound areas in a room where you can't hear it over there, but you can hear it over here. And you can't do that sort of sound field control very accurately without, at least using sound field synthesis you can't, without quite large numbers of loudspeakers. You can if you use very highly directional loudspeakers, but then you get into the problem of sound quality. So there are major channels of sound quality and bandwidth anyway in trying to do these sorts of solutions, but they generally do need quite large numbers of channels. Similarly, if you've got very large auditoria and you're trying to cover a very large space with something that is reasonably spatially accurate, then probably, again, you do need quite large numbers of channels. Whether you need that very dense coverage that is the responsibility of things like WFS and ambisonics, I don't know. But large auditoria are another clear candidate for lots of loudspeakers. But as many have suggested recently, we probably need to decouple the business of loudspeaker rendering from the business of spatial encoding. As we saw with those advanced stereo systems like Oro and Dolby Atmos and so forth, while they can specify to some degree where the loudspeakers are, they don't have any explicit means of saying how the loudspeakers should be driven. And what we really need is some sort of universal spatial encoding format that is independent of the loudspeaker array, so that we can simply say the sound source is supposed to be over there somewhere, sort of 12 degrees up and 30 degrees off to the right, and there's supposed to be this much ambience and envelopment. And the rest of it gets calculated according to the loudspeakers and where they are in the particular setup. So you can put your loudspeakers anywhere, and the rendering engine does its best to create something that is plausible based on the loudspeaker array that it's given. And then you can decode it for Auro, or you can decode it for wavefield synthesis, or you can decode it for what the hell you like. Decode it for headphones if you want to, providing that you've got a suitable rendering matrix or rendering engine that can do it for you. And these things can then be relatively independent of each other. So if we're to help this poor sound engineer who's trying to struggle between the two extremes of simplicity and complexity, we can give him perhaps some wise advice and say that the context is probably king in this circumstance, and that it depends on what you're trying to do with it as to which solution you need. Whatever that might be, we can say fairly truly from the experiments that we've done that timbral quality will always trump spatial quality, and if you've got a choice to be made between them, make sure it sounds nice timbrally first and then worry about whether it sounds nice spatially. There's absolutely no point having something that is fantastic spatially if it sounds awful. We need a universal spatial encoding format, something that is independent of the loudspeaker array layout. And from what we've seen, the evidence we've seen today, there are quite considerable arguments for keeping it simple and having as few loudspeakers as possible. Perfect sound field reconstruction over a wide area is actually impossible. If you can show me how it can be done, I'd be very interested to hear from you. So maybe we shouldn't be worrying about it quite as much as we are, because nearly accurate may be worse than not particularly accurate. It turns out that doing it badly may be better than doing it properly. And finally, from most of the experiments we've done, at least, most listeners don't care very much about image localization, which goes against the grain of the majority of experiments that have been done recently. So that's pretty much it. So we could, what time do you want to wrap up? Anyway, we can probably have a few questions and a bit of discussion. Yeah.
So early on, you talked about a good recording playback system is one where the speakers tend to disappear, that you hear through them.
Yeah.
Later in the presentation was the notion that perfectly time-aligned wavefront may not sound as pleasing as one that's deliberately messed up in time.
Yeah.
When you have the former, the particularly good sounding system that you can listen through the speakers,
yeah,
does that tend to be really well time-aligned or not so much?
Yeah. Yes, it does. And I think probably what seems to be the case is that this business of precise time alignment, most of the evidence from those experiments has been gained from fairly sophisticated large number of loudspeaker systems, which get into my sort of uncanny valley realm, where we can't separately localize the loudspeakers. Whereas the earlier one that I was talking about, the two-channel stereo, which generally sounds pretty good and it is perceived as uncolored, is a situation where you can localize the loudspeakers. And I think those two situations are different. So once we get into a fairly dense array of loudspeakers, whereby the individual loudspeaker sources within the array can't be separately identified, then it seems that we may get into a situation where time alignment becomes less desirable, where in fact messing it up a bit may help to avoid some of these. They're probably the results of fairly, if you've got a large number of loudspeakers that are interacting at the ears, creating a very comb filtery sort of pattern, it may be that the decoloration that results from misaligning the system is actually a sort of compensatory factor, that it helps to smooth out the otherwise unpleasant spectral dips. I mean, I don't know the answer for sure. It's just my hypothesis, really, that perhaps the misalignment is a sort of form of compensation for the fact that the ear can't decolor the signals anymore. But I don't know the answer for sure. It's just my guess. Yeah.
Perceptual wrote about conflicting effects and how if the conflicting comes about where each ear has different values in the response,
yeah,
your head tends to fill it in. Whereas if the conflicting is in the recording, so both of these get the exact same values, that's much more audible. I'm curious if the systems with both speakers tend to put the same artifact in both ears.
I wonder. I suppose the chances are that they do. I don't know. I haven't measured it, but my guess is that they would. And I suppose what he was suggesting was that when the results are different in both ears, when the filtering pattern is different in both ears, then you can null it out more easily than when they're the same. Yeah, I mean, my guess is that with the more spatially sophisticated formats, then the chances of there being greater similarities between the ears would be higher. But has anybody ever done any measurements that might help to show that to be true? I haven't myself, but it's a good idea. It's an interesting suggestion. Yes, Bob.
Now that I better understand your uncanny valley, you mentioned a couple of things in your talk. One was like a synthesized voice, and the other was a spatial approximation. I think the uncanny valley analogy is very good for the voice simulation, because if it's cartoon-like, you accept it.
Yeah.
If it's more like the real thing, pretty soon it starts to bother you because it's not quite right.
Yeah, yeah.
And if it was perfect, you would ignore it. But when it comes to spatial audio, one of my observations is that here we are in this business trying to recreate some kind of a sound field. And all we're doing is just the sound field, which always went with some kind of real-life other experience. So it seems to me that even if you could do a perfect sound field, if you lack other stimuli, particularly visual, you've got a big negative against you, because your brain, this is this cognitive dissonance concept, your brain is getting perhaps the real audio, but it doesn't know what context to place it in.
Yes.
So it's trying to make up something, and works for some, doesn't work for others.
Yeah.
It can be confusing. So I think that there's only so far you can go with the audio until you start to add some other sense to make it real. And right now, vision is one, and perhaps three-dimensional vision would be another.
I think you're right. I mean, there is this sense that, have you ever heard recordings made, say you made a binaural recording in your kitchen, which is often quite reverberant, and you play it back on headphones in your office or whatever, and your kitchen sounds much more reverberant without the visual experience of being in your kitchen than it does in your kitchen. I mean, when you're in your kitchen, you don't tend to think of it being particularly reverberant, but you hear a recording of it when you're sitting in front of your computer or whatever, and you think, is that my kitchen? Is that so reverberant? So the influence of the visual is very important, and I think you may be right that without the complete sensory experience, where you are immersed in the correct context from both the visual and the auditory sense, then the chance of a cognitive dissonance is greater. Are you suggesting that perhaps this uncanny valley could be crossed more easily if we had vision to accompany, say, wavefield synthesis, reconstruction, or what have you, and the audio on its own is never going to cut the mustard. Is that the sort of suggestion that you're making? Yeah.
And what I've been trying to do, and we've spoke with this group on in the past, is add at least something that I can control, which is the vision.
Yeah.
And it helps with some of the binaural discrepancies or confusions.
Yeah, it helps to disambiguate front and back and that sort of thing.
Which sometimes helps.
Yes, no, I agree with you. I think that, and I'm not actually saying that this uncanny valley concept translates perfectly into the spatial audio domain. It's just something to think about, really, that there may be, that as we get more sophisticated and as we get cleverer with sound reconstruction, that actually we may be bringing about another layer or another set of human critical faculties that starts to criticize it in a different way. I'm a bit like this with, say, well, I mean, you drink instant coffee and you sort of quite enjoy it because it's a drink, but you don't say, you don't necessarily compare it directly with ground coffee or what have you. You regard it as something sort of different and pleasant in its own right. And so the reference is not necessarily the same. You don't necessarily employ the same critical faculties. Yeah.
Would you consider binaural recording and reproduction kind of the gold standard in stereophony, or?
No, I wouldn't actually. That's a very, it's a long, sort of long answer about that one. Under some circumstances it can be, but that's a sort of another lecture altogether, really. There are, binaural recording ought, from a variety of points of view, to be the gold standard in sound reproduction, but there are an awful lot of reasons it turns out that it isn't, partly because head tracking is so difficult to do or to implement, because with natural reproduction, with natural listening, well, you know that when you move your head, the changes arise between the ears, and the sound source follows what you do with your head, and the changes arise as you move your head. And with binaural reproduction, as you move your head, unless you've got head tracking and some form of signal processing to alter the signal in response to movements of the head, doesn't do that, and so you're already missing one of the most important cues. Also, people's pin-iron head, the overall HRTFs of individuals differ very widely indeed, and it's actually very hard to find binaural functions that map nicely onto all listeners. So unless you've got personalized transfer functions or some generic function that just happens to work for you, then the results can be less than satisfactory. So although the concept of binaural reproduction is promising, the practice is much more difficult, and I therefore find it very hard to hold it up as the gold standard of spatial reproduction.
Do you think that the incongruity between a well-represented wavefield synthesis and an actual listening experience has to do with the boundary conditions being so close to being accurate but still having some kind of impact upon the total experience?
Yeah, I think wavefield synthesis again has the potential to be good, and I have heard some good results in carefully controlled surroundings. Most of the implementations I've heard in recent years have been pretty horrible, quite frankly, but that's just a personal opinion, because I think when it's set up badly in reflected rooms or with panels that make strange reflections and with panning systems that just give the impression that it's sort of sound coming out from a panel of loudspeakers, it's not very impressive. However, it's very difficult to create wavefield synthesis systems that have spatial aliasing frequencies that are much higher than about 3 or 4 kilohertz, because of the spacing between practical loudspeakers. And so you've got a very large part of the mid to high frequency spectrum which is not wavefield synthesis at all. It's spatially aliased wavefield synthesis, and that may be worse than than just having something rather similar to two-channel stereo. In fact, what Helmut Wittek did in his thesis experiments was to replace everything above the spatial aliasing frequency with two-channel stereo and compare it with spatially aliased WFS. And by and large, chopping everything above the spatial aliasing frequency off and replacing it with simpler stereo was much better and preferred to the other version. So I think there are very considerable limitations in practice to getting accurate sound field reconstruction because you can't get the loudspeakers close enough together. Yeah.
Well, given your whole story here that 2 channels is pretty good and more channels is not necessarily better, have you personally given any thought, you probably have, to designing your own system if you could do it from scratch? And say, let's put a priority maybe 70–80% on Tambo quality and 20–30% on spatial accuracy.
Yeah.
Approximate anyway. What would your system look like?
Yeah, very good. It would very much depend on what I was trying to do with it. If it was for musical entertainment purposes, I would say that really I wouldn't be bothering going much beyond. I do quite like 5-channel surround. It does have a certain advantage over 2-channel stereo, particularly when it comes to the immersive effect of reverberation in nice acoustical spaces and so forth. And so I think I probably, in my ideal entertainment system, would be going for something with a bit of a surround rather than just putting 2 channels in front of me. I'd be going for a system with very wide frequency range with as you say, a concentration on timbral quality. I think if I was designing a flight simulator, it would be a completely different matter because if there are certain circumstances where you do want very accurate phantom imaging or virtual source localization, because if you're trying to simulate the effect of missiles coming towards you from a certain location and needing to dodge them or what have you, otherwise you die, then you sort of need to know where they're coming from within a degree or two. And in that circumstance, we might get very different results because those results we got for the relative importance of timbral and spatial fidelity was under a sort of home entertainment context or scenario where we were asking people what they preferred to listen to with music and various other forms of broadcast and movie media. So it was definitely home entertainment. And we can say that there are a lot of other applications where those relative proportions of timbral and spatial fidelity would be different. I think we might find that the aircraft pilots would find the localization thing a lot more important than they would timbral fidelity. So yeah, for my home entertainment system, something probably rather like 5.1 would do fine, actually. Yeah. Bob.
I think to take that a little bit further, I think we'll you and Bob kind of hit on it a little bit. When you get to be so accurate that you can't tell that it's different, it kind of blends into the background, Bob said. It's like driving into work. I will never ignore my GPS, which sounds somewhat realistic, but I know it's not a realistic reproduction of the voice. But the guy that this news station has in Chicago, I can ignore him talking about the Edens every single morning when I know that I want to listen for that one road. It's the first one that comes up. And I remember that he's telling me about that road. So in the case of a heads-up display in a car with audio in a plane, I think when you're in that valley, like we are with the artificial speech that we use in the GPS, that sometimes you'll see when you're in like a theme park or somewhere where they'll put like a robot that'll catch your attention because it's kind of real but not real enough. If you want to really get someone's attention,
you make it
go so far that it blends in and you ignore it. Yeah, hit that valley and people are going to pay attention to what you want.
Yeah, it's a good point, isn't it? It's almost like make it freaky on purpose, just to grab people.
But we spent the last couple decades ignoring people and getting their attention with the audio work we're doing.
Yeah. So again, it's horses for courses, because I mean, if you're designing warning signals or you're designing things that you want people to listen to, then you want them to stand out. You don't want them to blend with the background. It's this business of making the loudspeakers disappear is largely about trying to translate what's in the recording through into the room rather than hearing the system. So you don't want to hear the system, you want to hear what's in the recording. And I think that's probably where the idea of making the loudspeakers disappear comes from. Well, maybe we'll stop there. I'm a bit jet lagged.